Has he suddenly blocked you, leaving you staring at an undelivered message whilst your stomach drops somewhere near your ankles? The brutal, deafening silence of a digital door slammed in your face is a uniquely visceral agony. But I need you to dry those tears this very instant, fix your posture, and listen to me closely. What if I told you that this block is not a formidable display of masculine strength, but rather the ultimate, painfully obvious confession that he has completely lost emotional control over you? Here is the absolute counterintuitive truth of human psychology. Utterly ignoring his little digital tantrum is the only possible way to finally be heard. Today, I am going to hand you the precise psychological antidote to the sting of his abandonment. We are going to seamlessly flip the power dynamic, transforming his petty attempt at punishment into his absolute deepest, most sleep-depriving regret. Let us be perfectly candid for a moment. Seeing that your messages are suddenly failing to deliver, or watching his profile vanish into the digital ether, feels rather like a sudden plunge into freezing water. It stings, it disorients you, and your immediate instinct is to panic, assuming you have been permanently discarded and forgotten. But I need you to pause. Pour yourself a glass of Merlot or a comforting cup of Earl Grey and look at this with absolute clarity. That digital barricade he has just erected, it is not the impenetrable fortress of a man who has genuinely moved on, but rather the hastily built sandcastle of a boy throwing an emotional tantrum. You must understand that blocking is rarely about erasing you from his memory. Rather, it is a calculated maneuver to establish a false sense of dominance over the dynamic. He hasn't blocked you to find inner peace, he has blocked you to administer a phantom punishment, hoping the sting of rejection will force you into submission. It is a highly orchestrated performance, a rather pathetic little theater production where he casts himself as the unattainable prize. He is simply waiting in the wings for you to audition for the role of the desperate, abandoned lover. At this very second, he is quietly and desperately anticipating your reaction, checking his phone with the anxious energy of a gambler waiting for the roulette wheel to stop. He fully expects the barrage of calls from a withheld number, the sudden appearance of a faceless Instagram account viewing his stories, or the tearful message sent to his mate's phone. He is literally banking on your emotional instability to feed his rather fragile, starving ego. If you give in and chase him through the back door, you are simply handing him the remote control to your nervous system. When you finally grasp the true psychology of blocking, his behavior ceases to be a formidable rejection and reveals itself as a deeply tragic cry for attention. It is the adult equivalent of a toddler holding their breath until they turn blue, secretly hoping you will rush over and surrender to their demands. He is using silence not as a healthy boundary, but as a weaponized hook designed to drag you back into his chaotic orbit. Recognizing this pathetic underlying motive is your first vital step towards reclaiming your absolute sovereignty. However, merely understanding the childish mechanics of his game is only half the battle. How you choose to maneuver through this manufactured silence will dictate who holds the ultimate power. Because the moment you realize the trap he has so carefully laid, you are faced with a crucial decision about how to respond to that closed door. And the way a high-value woman, a true strategist, handles a locked door is precisely what will catch his ego completely off guard and shatter his expectations. So the door has been slammed in your face, and the temptation to aggressively rattle the handle is almost entirely overwhelming. You want to explain, to argue, to have the final definitive word. It is a thoroughly natural, painfully human impulse. But this is precisely where we must introduce the rule of steel, a genuinely non-negotiable principle for the woman who values her dignity above a fleeting moment of validation. Under absolutely no circumstances whatsoever do you attempt to bypass that block. You do not morph into an amateur MI5 agent. You do not borrow your colleague's phone, and you certainly do not send a carrier pigeon. Instead, you are going to practice what I like to call majestic acceptance. You look at that digital wall he has so dramatically erected, and you gracefully bow out, leaving him standing there in the deafening silence of his own creation. You respect the closed door, not because he has commanded it like some petty tyrant, but because you possess an unshakable understanding of your own intrinsic worth. A queen, my dear, simply does not lower herself to force entry into spaces, digital or otherwise, where her presence is not enthusiastically celebrated. When that Friday evening inevitably rolls around and the urge to check if you are still blocked threatens to ruin your mood, I want you to ruthlessly redirect that energy. Rather than staring at a blank chat screen as if it might magically sprout a profound apology, run yourself a bath with impossibly expensive oils, pour a generous glass of Sancerre, and bury yourself in a captivating novel. You must treat his sudden absence not as a tragic, heartbreaking loss, but a rather delightful, unprompted holiday from his emotional turbulence. Let him stew in his barricaded little fortress while you luxuriate in your own peace. By doing absolutely nothing, you are executing the most ruthless and brilliant psychological maneuver possible. He built this wall fully expecting you to repeatedly bash your head against it, desperately trying to claw your way back into his good graces. When you simply walk away without so much as a backward glance, it utterly short-circuits his mental wiring. He is left entirely alone with his fragile ego, holding a heavy shield against an attack that is never going to come. It is, quite frankly, terribly embarrassing for him. Your absolute, unwavering silence in the face of his grand, dramatic gesture initiates a profound shift in the underlying power dynamic of your connection. While he genuinely thought he was cutting you off to assert his ultimate dominance, your majestic indifference has just stripped him of any control he thought he possessed. And as the days tick by and the absolute terrifying void of your absence begins to echo in his mind, something rather fascinating begins to happen to that false sense of power he was so desperately clinging to. Let us examine the rather delicious irony of what happens when you simply drop your end of the rope in his little emotional tug-of-war. This is the paradox of regret in action. By refusing to react and utterly declining the invitation to chase him, the false sense of power he derived from blocking you evaporates into entirely thin air. He anticipated a desperate pursuit, a dramatic display of your affection. Instead, he has been met with a formidable, deafening silence. Without your frantic energy to sustain it, his grand gesture of dominance quickly begins to feel like a tremendously foolish miscalculation. The very block that was designed to punish you and force your submission has swiftly transformed into his own personal, self-constructed mental prison. He is now trapped behind a barricade of his own making, unable to simply lower it without completely losing face. Understanding the psychology of blocking requires you to realize that he desperately needs your reaction to validate his worth. Without it, he is merely a man shouting into an entirely empty room. What began as a strategic maneuver to make you miss him has spectacularly backfired, leaving him isolated with his own raging insecurities. Slowly but surely, a deeply uncomfortable agony begins to take root in his mind. Why on earth didn't she fight for me? A man's ego is a rather fragile, elastic construct, and when you fail to desperately pull at it, it simply snaps back and hits him squarely in the face. Whilst you are out enjoying a perfectly poured gin and tonic on a Saturday afternoon, completely unbothered, he is sitting at the pub with his mates, pretending to watch the football, whilst secretly obsessing over your absolute lack of panic. It is a delightfully pathetic predicament he has engineered entirely by himself. As the days pass, a deeply majestic absence becomes the loudest sound in his world, a psychological torment far worse than any angry paragraph you could have possibly sent. The silence forces him to confront his absolute lack of control over you, breeding a rampant paranoia about what you might be doing and, crucially, who you might be doing it with. He blocked you to teach you a lesson, yet he is the one currently sitting in the detention of his own mind, desperately trying to solve the puzzle of your indifference. His pride is slowly suffocating under the heavy weight of your unbothered grace. Eventually, the unbearable pressure of his own mounting curiosity will force his hand, because a man in this fragile position simply cannot resist the urge to peek at the consequences of his actions. His ego will inevitably crack, and he will quietly, stealthily dismantle that digital wall just to spy on the emotional wreckage he assumes he left behind. But when he finally creeps back to check on the woman he thought he had successfully broken, the reality he is about to face will be an entirely different, far more intimidating proposition. While he is busy orchestrating his own miserable little digital exile, you are going to embark on what I refer to as the phantom upgrade. It is the quiet, absolutely lethal elevation of your life that occurs entirely out of his sight. He expects his absence to act as a pause button on your existence, assuming you are sitting in your pajamas, tragically weeping over his digital ghost. But the true psychology of blocking dictates that a high-value woman never halts her glorious progress for a man who has actively chosen to make himself invisible. Instead of wallowing in a manufactured heartbreak, your life simply moves forward with ruthless, elegant momentum. You level up. When he confidently assumes you are aggressively refreshing your feed in a state of utter despair, you are actually investing in a rather fabulous new wardrobe, thriving in your career, or finally booking that trip to the Amalfi Coast. You shine, utterly undimmed by his absence, treating his little silent treatment not as a punishment, but as a gloriously uninterrupted period of self-enhancement. And then comes the inevitable climax of this pathetic little play, because, as any seasoned strategist will tell you, they always come back to spy. His fragile ego will eventually crack under the immense, suffocating weight of his own curiosity, and he will quietly unblock you late on a Tuesday night to assess the emotional wreckage. He expects to peek through the digital keyhole and find a stagnant, broken woman desperately waiting for his triumphant return. He is entirely banking on your misery to validate his foolish power trip. Imagine his absolute stomach-dropping horror then, when he unblocks you only to discover a majestic, entirely unreachable version of the woman he thought he had discarded. It is akin to a man returning to a property he thought he had successfully demolished, only to find a spectacular, heavily guarded palace built in its place. He sees you glowing, fiercely independent, and entirely unbothered by the little tantrum he threw. The realization hits him like a brisk splash of freezing water. His absence did not destroy you, it simply cleared the stage for your finest act. In that devastating moment, the block completely transforms into his deepest, most profound regret, cementing your status as the ultimate prize he was simply too foolish to hold on to. He is left entirely powerless, staring through a screen at a masterpiece he is no longer permitted to touch. But once we have successfully driven him to this exquisite point of psychological surrender, how do we finally close the curtain on his childish performance and leave the audience forever changed by this masterclass in absolute sovereignty? Before we part ways today, I have a rather entertaining inquiry for you. Head down to the comments and tell me, what is the absolute most pathetic, desperate reaction you have ever witnessed from a man who dramatically blocked you, only to come crawling back when he realized his silence had completely failed? Do share your stories below. I must admit, I find these little tales of shattered egos and spectacular backfires tremendously amusing. If you are quite finished with being a casualty in these childish little power plays, and you are finally ready to master the dark, elegant psychology of high-value relationships, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Destiny's Decree. Do ensure you activate the notification bell, my dear. You simply cannot afford to miss your next masterclass in absolute sovereignty. Until next time, remember, a queen never forces a locked door. She simply builds a better castle.